Stop calling. We don't have time for you. Those were the exact words my daughter said to me. Her voice was flat, irritated, like I was some telemarketer interrupting her evening, not the woman who had given her life. The silence after she hung up was deafening. I sat there at my kitchen table, the phone still in my hand, staring at the wall as if it could explain what had just happened. My hand trembled. My throat tightened. I whispered to myself, "She didn't mean it. She's just stressed." She didn't mean it. But deep down, I knew she did. Before I tell you everything, let me ask you, where are you watching from? Please write it in the comments. I'd love to know. Maybe it sounds silly, but hearing from you wherever you are makes me feel a little less alone in this world. My name is Martha. I'm 71 years old, and I've been a widow for 12 years. My husband, Harold, was the love of my life. We built this home together, brick by brick, memory by memory. I used to think the laughter of our children would always echo in these walls. We had 2 kids, Daniel and Elaine. I poured every ounce of myself into raising them. I worked extra shifts, stretched every dollar, and sacrificed my own wants so they could have a life better than mine. When Harold passed, I told myself that as long as I had my children, I wouldn't be alone. But loneliness has a cruel way of creeping in. It wasn't always like this. When they were younger, they used to call me for advice, for comfort. My daughter would phone me late at night when her babies had fevers asking, "Mom, what should I do?" My son used to come over just to sit in the backyard and have coffee with me. Back then, I felt needed. I felt loved. But slowly, as the years went by, their voices grew colder. Their visits grew shorter. I became something they checked off their list, like paying bills or running errands. And still I called. I called because I missed them. I called because sometimes the silence of this house was so heavy, it felt like it would crush me. I called because I still believed I was their mother, and mothers are supposed to reach out. That day when Elaine snapped, "Stop calling, we don't have time for you," it was like she had finally said what they'd both been thinking all along. I sat at the table for hours after, staring at the phone, willing it to ring, but it never did. The next morning, I made myself a cup of tea and carried it to the window. Outside, the world was waking up, children walking to school, neighbors starting their cars. I watched one family across the street, a little girl running to hug her grandmother. The woman bent down, scooped her up, kissed her cheek. I pressed my hand to the glass, my eyes stinging. "That used to be me," I whispered into the empty room. "What did I do wrong? Why don't they want me anymore?" But the walls had no answers. It's hard to explain the ache of being unwanted by the very people you gave your life to. It's a grief that doesn't end because the people who are supposed to love you most keep choosing not to. I spent that entire week replaying our conversations in my head, trying to find where I had become too much. Was I calling too often? Was I asking too many questions? Or had they just outgrown me? At night, I'd pull out old photo albums, pictures of birthday parties where I baked the cakes from scratch. Christmas mornings where I stayed up all night wrapping presents so the magic wouldn't fade. School graduations where I cheered louder than anyone. I stared at their young faces in those photographs and wondered if those children were still somewhere inside the adults who now treated me like a burden. That was the beginning of the unraveling. The moment I realized I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. That moment, those words, "Stop calling, we don't have time for you," then became the spark that lit a fire inside me. I didn't know it then, but those words would change everything. They would be the reason I walked into my lawyer's office, the reason I picked up a pen and rewrote my will, and the reason my children, the very ones who pushed me away, would come crawling back, begging for something they no longer deserved. But I'm getting ahead of myself because before I could reach that point, I had to face the truth I had been running from for years. I was not wanted, and that truth broke me before it made me stronger. When you're young, you think sacrifice is temporary. You tell yourself, "I'll work hard now so my family will have it easier later." You think the love you pour out will be returned when you're old and tired. I was 19 when I married Harold. He was 21, full of energy, full of dreams. We didn't have much, just a tiny rented apartment and secondhand furniture, but we had each other, and back then that was enough. Harold worked in construction, long days that left his hands rough and calloused. I took a job as a secretary at a small insurance office, typing reports by day and coming home to cook dinner by night. We were young, poor, but hopeful. When Daniel was born, I remember counting coins to buy his first crib. We couldn't afford new clothes, so I learned how to sew tiny onesies from fabric scraps. When Elaine came 3 years later, Harold picked up extra shifts to make sure she had a proper nursery. We didn't complain. We thought, this is what parents do. There were years where Harold and I didn't buy ourselves a single new thing. No vacations, no fancy dinners. I wore the same winter coat for nearly a decade, patching the sleeves when they frayed so that my children could have new shoes each school year. I worked nights tutoring neighborhood kids just to afford Daniel's summer baseball camp. When Elaine begged for piano lessons, I took a second part-time job at the library to make it happen. Thought those sacrifices would bind us together. I thought they'd look back one day and say, Mom always put us first. We'll always be there for her. Harold used to say, Martha, one day we'll rest. The kids will be grown and we'll travel. Maybe finally see the ocean. I'd smile and nod, holding on to that picture. But Harold never got that chance. He was 58 when his heart gave out. I remember that day like a scar I can't hide. He had been working overtime on a house project, came home pale and tired, sat in his chair, and never stood again. My world shattered. I thought I'd break too. But then I looked at Daniel and Elaine, already adults, but still my babies, and I told myself, you can't fall apart. You have to be strong for them. So I swallowed my grief and carried on. I made holidays happen, even when it meant cooking for hours alone. I showed up at every birthday, every school play, every graduation. I cheered the loudest. I clapped until my hands stung. I smiled through the ache in my chest. I kept Harold's memory alive for them too. Every Christmas, I'd tell stories about his jokes, his big laugh, the way he used to dance in the kitchen. I thought it mattered to them. I thought they cherished those memories. After Harold's death, I managed our finances carefully. He had left behind savings, the house, and small investments. It wasn't millions, but it was security. I guarded it fiercely. Not for myself, but for my children. I even went to a lawyer to set up a will. It felt strange writing down who would get what when I was gone, but I told myself it was my last gift to them to make sure they'd be taken care of, just like Harold and I had always dreamed. I named them both as beneficiaries. Of course I did. Who else would I leave it to? They were my family. They were my life. I remember sitting in that office, pen in hand, thinking, they'll never have to worry. This will be my legacy. Not money, but love in the form of security. Looking back, I almost laugh at my own naivety. I thought they would always remember the sacrifices I made, the hours I worked, the tears I hid. I thought they would never forget who held them when they were sick, who stayed awake through fevers, who prayed over them at night. I thought I had earned their love. But love, I would learn, isn't something you can earn with sacrifice. It isn't guaranteed, even from your own children. I kept on giving year after year, never once imagining that the day would come when they would sigh at the sound of my voice, that they'd look at their phones, see my name, and feel burdened. I gave them everything, and somehow, in their eyes, it still wasn't enough. It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruelest part. If Daniel and Elaine had simply turned their backs one day and said, "We don't want you in our lives," maybe it would have been easier to accept. A clean wound heals faster. But what I got was a slow bleed. Small cuts over years, each one harder to ignore, until I realized I was drowning in them. At first it was little things. Daniel used to visit me every Sunday morning. He'd drink coffee in the backyard, just like his father used to, and we'd talk about work, politics, the garden. Then one week he didn't show up. He texted later, "Busy mom, maybe next week." Next week came, he didn't. Elaine used to call me at least twice a week just to check in. Sometimes she'd talk my ear off about her kids, her job, her husband's family. I didn't mind. I loved listening. I loved knowing I was still part of her world. Then her calls grew shorter. Then they stopped coming unless I called her first. And when I called, her tone was different, irritated, distracted, as if my voice was interrupting something important. "Yes, Mom. What is it now?" I tried to ignore the sting. I told myself, they're adults now with busy lives. Be understanding. But the more I excused it, the more the distance grew. I baked Daniel's favorite peach pie one summer afternoon and drove across town to drop it off. His wife opened the door, surprised to see me. "Oh, you didn't have to," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I set the pie down on the counter and left, thinking I'd made a nice gesture. A week later, I stopped by again, and there it was, the pie, untouched, still in the tin, shoved to the back of their fridge. The peaches had turned brown. My heart sank. Elaine once asked me to babysit her kids while she ran errands. I stayed all afternoon playing board games, making grilled cheese sandwiches, laughing with them. When she came back, she barely looked at me. She just said, "Thanks, I'll text you later." I waited for that text. It never came. And then there was the phone call. One evening, I dialed Daniel just to ask how his week was going. The line clicked and I heard him speaking to his wife before he realized I was on the line. His voice was hushed, annoyed. "She's too clingy. She needs to stop calling all the time." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. He came back on the line a second later, his tone suddenly cheerful. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" I mumbled something about forgetting why I called. My voice cracked, but I forced a laugh. After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room for hours, staring at the photos on the wall. There was Daniel, age 6, grinning with missing teeth. Elaine in her ballet costume, twirling in the living room. Me standing behind them, proud and young and hopeful. I whispered to those photos. When did I become too much for you? When did my love turn into a burden? That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, too heavy. I found myself listening for a sound that would never come. Harold's voice telling me I wasn't crazy, that our children loved me, that this was just a rough patch, but the only sound was the ticking clock on the mantel. The next morning, I made tea and sat by the window, just as I always did. I watched neighbors coming and going. Across the street, a young man carried groceries up the steps to his mother's house. She opened the door, hugged him, kissed his cheek. I pressed my fingers to the glass, tears blurring my vision. I wanted to believe Daniel and Elaine would come around. That they'd remember all the nights I stayed awake with them through fevers, all the sacrifices I made so they could go to college, all the times I put myself second so they could be first. But as the weeks turned into months, the distance only grew. My phone, once full of their calls, now sat in silence. When it did ring, it was a telemarketer, or a wrong number, never them. I started waiting for their voices, the way some people wait for miracles, knowing deep down it might never happen. And still, I kept calling. Because hope is stubborn. Because I couldn't bear the thought that my children, my own flesh and blood, no longer wanted me. It's one thing to be hurt in private. It's another to be humiliated in front of others. That day is seared into my memory like a scar. It was my granddaughter's birthday. She was turning 8, a sweet little girl with bright eyes and curly hair who still ran to hug me when she saw me. I thought, maybe this will be different. Maybe at least today, I'll feel like part of the family again. I spent the morning baking her favorite chocolate cake, just like I used to when Daniel and Elaine were children. My hands shook as I spread the frosting, but my heart felt full. I wrapped a doll I'd saved up for, tying the bow carefully, wanting her gift to stand out among the rest. When I arrived at Elaine's house, the driveway was full. Cars lined the street. Laughter spilled out from the backyard. I walked in holding the cake and the gift, and for a moment I almost felt normal again. Children were running, balloons tied to the fence, music playing low. I greeted people, set the cake down on the table, and took a seat. At first, everything seemed fine. I helped cut slices of pizza for the kids, tied ribbons back in little ponytails, smiled when people said, "Oh, you must be Elaine's mom." But then it happened. Elaine was surrounded by a few other mothers, chatting about school schedules and vacations. I stepped over, smiling, and tried to join in. "When your brother was that age," I began softly, "he used to." Elaine cut me off mid-sentence. Her voice was sharp, louder than it needed to be. "Mom, please stop calling me for every little thing. We're busy. We can't always pick up the phone." The words hung in the air. For a second, I thought maybe no one had heard. But then I saw the sideways glances, the raised eyebrows, the smirk tugging at one woman's lips. Someone stifled a laugh. I felt my face burn. My hands shook. I tried to force a smile, but my throat was tight, my chest heavy. I nodded like it was nothing, like I wasn't just stripped bare in front of strangers. Elaine turned back to her friends, laughing as if nothing had happened. I wanted to vanish. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. Instead, I excused myself and sat alone on a bench near the fence, watching the children run around while trying to keep tears from falling. My granddaughter came over once, tugging on my sleeve. "Grandma, will you play with me?" she asked. My heart cracked. I smiled through the ache and said, "Of course, sweetheart." For her, I forced myself to keep going. But inside, something broke. The ride home felt endless. The cake plate rattled in the passenger seat, empty except for crumbs. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind replayed Elaine's voice, sharp and dismissive. Stop calling me for every little thing. At home, I placed the empty cake dish in the sink and sank into a chair. The house was silent. I glanced at the mantel where our family photos sat, Harold holding baby Daniel, me helping Elaine ride her first bike, Christmas mornings with presents stacked high, smiles frozen in time, proof of a family that once needed me. I picked up one photo, Daniel at 5 years old, frosting smeared across his cheeks. I remembered the way he used to cling to my leg, begging me not to leave when I went to work. Tears blurred the image as I whispered, "When did I stop being someone worth calling?" That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, staring at my phone. For the first time in my life, I didn't want to dial either of my children. Not because I didn't miss them, but because I couldn't bear to hear that tone again, that sigh, that dismissal. I realized then I had to become invisible to them. Worse, I had become an inconvenience. And as much as it broke me, that realization planted a seed. A quiet thought I tried to push away at first. If they don't have time for me in their lives, why should I leave them everything when I'm gone? It was the first time I allowed myself to even imagine a life where my sacrifices didn't automatically belong to them. That thought scared me, but it also freed me just a little. I didn't know it then. But the humiliation I felt that day, the sting of being dismissed like a nuisance in front of strangers, was the crack that let the light in. It was the beginning of my resolve, because I would never let them take me for granted again. The night after Elaine's birthday party, I sat at the kitchen table long after the sun had set. The empty teacup in front of me had gone cold hours ago. I kept staring at the stack of unopened mail, the pile of bills and letters. Anything to avoid the echo of my daughter's voice in my head. "Mom, please stop calling. We don't have time for you." Her words played over and over, sharper each time. I pressed my hands against my ears, but they wouldn't stop. I had spent decades giving, serving, loving, and now I was a burden. Finally, I stood up and walked to the cabinet where Harold and I had kept our important documents. My fingers trembled as I pulled out the old folder, the one with our mortgage papers, birth certificates, and my will. The last time I had looked at it, Harold was still alive. We had sat together at the lawyer's office, holding hands, telling ourselves this was a practical step for the future. I remembered how I'd written down Daniel's name, then Elaine's, smiling as I signed the paper. I thought it was love in ink, security for our children. I thought it meant they'd always carry a piece of us. But now, staring at those names, all I felt was bitterness. I traced their signatures with my finger and whispered, "You told me you don't have time for me, so why should I leave you my life's work?" The next morning, I made an appointment with my lawyer. The receptionist looked surprised when I arrived. "Mrs. Carter, it's been years. Everything all right?" I smiled faintly. "Everything's fine. I just need to make a change." Inside his office, the lawyer adjusted his glasses, pulling up my file. "So, you'd like to update your beneficiaries?" "That's simple enough. Just tell me what you'd like." For a moment, I hesitated. Saying the words out loud felt like betrayal. A part of me still wanted to believe Daniel and Elaine would come back, would remember the mother who raised them. But then I saw Elaine's smirk, Daniel's dismissive whisper. I remembered the untouched pie in their fridge. My voice came out steady. "Remove their names. Both of them." The lawyer blinked. "Both." "Mrs. Carter, are you sure it's unusual?" "I'm sure." My tone surprised even me. Firm cold. He leaned back, studying me. "And who would you like the estate to go to instead?" I sat quietly for a moment. Then I thought of Harold, of the way his eyes softened whenever he saw children laugh. I thought of the evenings we dreamed of doing more for others if we had the means. "To the children's hospital," I said finally, "and a scholarship in Harold's name at the local college. Let his legacy live on where it matters, where it will be appreciated." The lawyer nodded slowly. "That's a noble choice. Noble maybe, but to me it felt like survival." As I signed the papers, my hand didn't shake. I felt a strange calm settle over me, like I was finally taking back something I hadn't realized I'd given away, my dignity. When the pen left the paper, I exhaled. For the first time in years, I wasn't writing my children into my future. I was writing myself free. On the drive home, I rolled down the window, letting the wind rush through my hair. The sky was stray with orange and pink, the kind of sunset Harold used to love. I whispered, "We did it, Harold. We finally put ourselves first." That night, I slept better than I had in months. In the morning, I woke with a sense of lightness. I made coffee, tended to my small garden, and hummed as I worked. My phone sat on the counter, silent. For once, I didn't mind because now I wasn't waiting for their calls anymore. Secrets don't stay hidden forever. And mine? The change I'd made at the lawyer's office wasn't going to either. I hadn't planned on telling Daniel or Elaine. In fact, I thought maybe they'd never know until I was gone. But life has a way of spilling what you think you've locked away. It was Daniel who found out first. A friend of his worked at the same law firm, and though he wasn't supposed to say a word, whispers spread quickly in small towns. One evening, my phone rang. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize the number. Daniel hadn't called me in weeks. I answered, "Hello." His voice was too cheerful, too. "Hi, Mom. How are you? I was just thinking about you. Just thinking about me." Funny how convenient that thought must have been. The next day, Elaine called, too. "Hi, Mom. Guess what? I'm making your lasagna recipe tonight. Thought I'd check in." Her voice was honeyed, dripping with sweetness I hadn't heard in years. And then it began. For the first time in months, my phone rang every day. Sometimes more than once. Daniel showed up on a random Thursday evening, arms full of groceries. "I thought I'd cook dinner for you, Mom," he said, already glancing around my house like he was taking inventory. Ella stopped by with flowers, her kids trailing behind her. She kissed my cheek, hugged me tightly, and whispered, "We should spend more time together. Family's important. Family's important." Where had that belief been when I was sitting by the window begging for a single call? Where was it when Elaine told me to stop bothering her? At first, I almost let myself believe them. I almost thought, maybe this is real. Maybe they do still love me. But then I saw the way their eyes lingered on my jewelry box, the way Daniel asked casual questions about my bank account, the way Elaine joked about who would get the house one day. It wasn't me they wanted. It was what I had. I'd always prided myself on knowing my children's voices, every tone, every inflection. And now when they spoke to me, I could hear the hollowness. The words were sweet, but the meaning was empty. One Saturday, Daniel invited me to lunch. We sat across from each other in a crowded cafe, and for a while, I let him talk. He told me about his job, his kids, his plans. He smiled a lot, too much. Finally, he leaned in, lowering his voice. "Mom, I heard some things about you changing your will. That's not true, right?" There it was, the mask slipping. I sipped my tea slowly, keeping my eyes on his. "And if it is," his smile faltered. He laughed nervously. "Come on, Mom. That's just silly. Of course you'd leave things to your children. That's what family does." Family? The word tasted bitter. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence told him everything. From that day on, the visits grew more frantic. Elaine started dropping by unannounced, bringing casseroles, fussing over the curtains, pretending to care about my health. "Are you taking your vitamins, Mom? You really should see the doctor more often. We care about you." But I saw through it. The affection wasn't love. It was desperation. At night, I sat in my chair, listening to the phone ring, their voices leaving cheerful messages on the answering machine. And instead of feeling joy, I felt sad. Sad for them, for the way greed had hollowed them out. Sad for myself that I once believed love like theirs could never fade. But underneath that sadness was something else too. Something stronger. Resolve. Because for the first time, I wasn't chasing them. I wasn't waiting by the phone. I wasn't baking pies just to be ignored. They were the ones scrambling, begging, chasing, and I realized something powerful. I wasn't powerless anymore. They had pushed me aside, and I had finally pushed back. Not with yelling, not with tears, but with ink on paper. And now they were the ones left scrambling in the silence I used to know too well. It was bound to happen. Pretending only lasts so long. For weeks, Daniel and Elaine had been circling me like vultures, trying to act like dutiful children. Phone calls, visits, casseroles, grocery runs, all of it dripping with a sweetness I hadn't tasted in years. But I could smell the rot underneath. One Sunday afternoon, they both showed up at my house together. That almost never happened. Usually they could barely stand to be in the same room, always competing for my attention or Harold's old possessions, but that day they came united. Which only meant one thing. They wanted answers. I was sitting in the living room knitting by the window when I heard Daniel's heavy knock. Elaine's voice followed. "Mom, we're here. Surprise!" I opened the door to see them both smiling too wide, their arms full of grocery bags. We thought we'd make lunch, Elaine said quickly, brushing past me before I could answer. Daniel followed, setting the bags down on the counter with a loud thud. I watched them bustle around the kitchen, pretending to be a happy family. My heart ached at how fake it all was. I sat at the table silent, waiting for the real reason they were there to come spilling out. And it did. Once the food was in the oven and the small talk dried up, Daniel cleared his throat. He glanced at Elaine, then looked at me. "Mom," he began carefully, "we heard something about you changing your will." Elaine leaned forward, her voice soft, almost pleading. "It's just a rumor, right? You wouldn't really cut us out." "I mean, we're your children." There it was, the truth behind the flowers and phone calls. I set down my knitting, folded my hands, and looked them both in the eye. And if I did, Daniel's jaw tightened. "Mom, that's not fair. After everything we've done for you, I couldn't help it." I laughed. A short, bitter sound that surprised even me. "Everything you've done for me. Tell me, Daniel, what exactly have you done for me? Was it the weeks you ignored my calls? The pies left to rot in your fridge? The whispers about me being clingy? Or was it the way your sister humiliated me in front of her friends, telling me she had no time for me?" Elaine's face flushed red. "That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant," I snapped, my voice sharper than I'd ever allowed it to be. "Don't you dare stand in my house and talk about fairness when you've treated me like a burden for years." The room went quiet. The oven hummed, the clock ticked, and the only sound was my breathing, heavy but steady. Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower, harder. "So what? You're just going to give everything to strangers? To some charity? That's ridiculous, Mom. Family should come first." Family. That word again. Always on their lips when it was convenient. When it meant money, when it meant inheritance. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on his. Family. Family doesn't hang up on you. Family doesn't tell you you're too much. Family doesn't make you feel like garbage in front of others. You had no time for me when I needed you most. So now I have no time for you. Not in my life and not in my will. Elaine's mouth opened, then closed again. She looked like a child caught lying, her eyes darting to Daniel for support. He stood, anger flashing in his eyes, but he didn't move closer. I sat back, my hands steady in my lap. I'm not doing this out of spite. I'm doing it because I finally understand. You don't love me. You love what I can give you. And I won't spend my last years begging for scraps of affection or bribing you with promises of money I'll never see. I'd rather give it to people who need it, who will cherish Harold's memory, who will appreciate what we built." The silence was deafening. Daniel finally muttered, "Unbelievable," and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. Elaine lingered, tears brimming in her eyes. "Mom," she whispered, "please." But the words I had waited decades to hear. "I'm sorry. I love you." I was wrong. Never came. She turned and followed her brother out. I sat alone at the table again, but this time I wasn't broken. My heart was heavy, yes, but it was also free. For once I had spoken the truth, and it had power. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't scare me. After they left that day, the house was quiet again. For years, that silence had felt like a punishment, a hollow ache that reminded me I was unwanted. But now it felt different. I sat at the kitchen table, the casserole coolings in the oven, untouched. Their voices no longer echoed in my ears. Instead, Harold's laughter came back to me, faint but warm. I could almost hear him saying, "You finally did it, Martha. You finally chose yourself." And he was right. In the days that followed, Daniel and Elaine called a few more times. Their messages shifted quickly from sweet to sour. At first, "Mom, we love you. We're family. Let's not fight." Then when I didn't respond, "You're making a mistake. You're being manipulated. You'll regret this." But I didn't. Not for a single second. Instead of answering their calls, I started filling my days with things I had once put aside. I joined a book club at the library. I planted roses in Harold's old garden bed, watching the buds rise toward the sun. I began volunteering twice a week at the children's hospital, the very place that would one day hold Harold's legacy. Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and see a sick child smile because you brought them a storybook or a handmade quilt or just your presence? It feels like being needed again. Not for money, not for inheritance, for love, for humanity. I hadn't realized how starved I was for genuine affection until I found it outside my family. One afternoon, as I left the hospital, a little boy ran up and hugged my legs. "Thank you, Miss Martha," he said softly, clutching the toy car I had given him. His mother's eyes brimmed with tears. "You've been a blessing," she whispered. "Blessing?" That word wrapped around me like a blanket. I hadn't felt like a blessing in years. And in that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. The truth is, family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people you choose, the ones who see you, who value you, who love you, without asking for anything in return. Daniel and Elaine had made their choice long ago. They chose distance. They chose coldness. They chose convenience over love. So I chose myself. I chose to leave behind more than money. I chose to leave behind kindness, hope, and opportunity in Harold's name. A scholarship that would help young people chase their dreams. Donations that would give sick children a fighting chance. A legacy of love that could not be erased by neglect. Do I still miss my children? Of course. I am a mother. A mother's heart never fully stops longing, no matter how deep the wound. Sometimes late at night, I catch myself staring at the phone, wishing it would ring. Not with greed, not with anger, but with love. But I no longer beg for it. And that makes all the difference. I think back to that day at Elaine's house when she dismissed me in front of her friends. I think back to Daniel's whisper on the phone, calling me clingy. Those moments used to break me. Now they remind me of how far I've come because I know my worth now. I am not just a mother, not just a widow, not just an old woman, sitting by the window waiting for the phone to ring. I am Martha. I am 71 years old, and I have survived heartbreak, humiliation, and loneliness. And I have built myself back up piece by piece. And when my children came begging, when they finally realized what they had lost, I didn't crumble, I didn't bend, I stood tall, I smiled, not out of spite, but out of peace, out of strength. Out of the quiet certainty that I no longer needed their approval to feel whole. So, if you're listening to this wherever you are and you've been told you're too much or that you're a burden or that you don't matter, hear me now. You do matter. Your worth isn't measured by the people who fail to see it. Your love, your sacrifices, your kindness, they are not wasted even if your family chooses to forget them. Because one day you will find a place, a person, a purpose that reminds you you are never too much. You are always enough. And as for me, I may have lost the love of my children, but I found something even greater. I found myself, and that I think is the best inheritance of all.